Oh, it's good coffee. No, I'm just working on being an influencer. I figured I should practice now. Like, I'm not being paid by Starbucks, but the dream, right, is someday they will pay me, or at least like give me free coffee, because then I could save a lot of money if I was getting that. It's the dream. Okay. So today we're going to continue talking about DNA, because that's what we talked about in our last video. But we learned that important lesson that in biology, structure determines function. The way things are put together determines how they work. And I also mentioned this, another way of saying this was anatomy determines physiology. We spent a lot of time going through the structure of DNA. And now that we know that structure, we can start to learn about the function of DNA and what does DNA actually do. And as you probably guessed, a complicated molecule like DNA has a complicated answer about what it actually does. But now that we actually know the structure, we can start to learn about this. In order for us to understand this, though, we need to learn about one more molecule that exists inside of all of our cells, whether we're humans or plants or fungus or bacteria. There's one molecule that is incredibly important to the way that our bodies actually work, and that is something called a protein. So we're going to start today by learning about what is protein so that we can understand how does DNA actually work. Now, just a reminder though, one of the things we talked about yesterday was a polymer. Remember, a polymer is something that is made out of repeating parts. And so when we talked about DNA, the repeating polymer was something called a nucleotide. Now, this is going to be really important because we're going to talk about proteins, which are also a polymer, but are built out of something different. Remember, I talked about how a polymer is really similar to like a big chain. It's taking a bunch of really similar things and connecting them together to make a longer structure. So if you think about a chain, you take your individual links, you connect them together, and that gives you something much, much different by the time that you're done than the individual link, right? A link in the chain is different than the actual chain. Now, we're talking about this because today we're going to start by talking about proteins, and first and foremost, proteins are also a polymer. Now, they're a polymer that does something very different. One thing we learned is that DNA stores information, but proteins have very different functions because they're different molecules. The first function that we need to talk about is that protein builds structures. And so when we talk about structures, we're actually talking about like physical parts of the body. So my fingernails are made out of a protein called keratin. And this protein is actually the same protein that my hair is made out of. They're both made out of keratin. This keratin is really not that different from the keratin found in other animals. So things like feathers are largely made out of keratin, another protein. In some animals like a rhinoceros, their horn is made out of keratin, essentially. And so you have all of these different structural things that are being put together by one protein. Now, there are other proteins that are building different structures. My bones are largely made of protein that's secreted by cells. And my muscles are made out of a different protein. And those proteins in my muscles are called actin and myosin. And they allow my proteins to be able to like contract so that I could move around and talk with my hands a lot. But you have all sorts of different proteins, whether it's elastin to make things in my skin elastic, or like I said, the actin myosin in my muscles that allow me to have things that contract so that I can move, or having keratin to build up hard structures. That is one of the major roles of protein, is to build structures. Now, the other function of proteins is that they build and break apart other things. And I know Ms. Kolesnikov would be like flabbergasted by my use of the word things, but I don't really know how else to say it because proteins build everything, break everything. They are the workers inside of your cells. Proteins really not only build most of the stuff that you are made out of, they are the things that actually built it. So they are not only the materials, but they are also the builders. And this is because there are thousands of different proteins. Now, I think a great way to think about proteins is to understand a little bit about the cell. So remember in the cell, let's draw it down here. This is my cell, and you have different structures. Those structures are called the organelles. Remember, the organelles, they carry out the functions of the cell. So there's things like the endoplasmic reticulum, right? Probably learned it's like a series of channels in the cell. There's the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus is like the post office of the cell. You have like the centrioles. I always like the centrioles because they look like little licorice. They make me hungry to think about it. You have lysosomes, you have vacuoles, but you also have everybody's favorite, the mitochondria. The powerhouse of the cell. People only know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell because like somebody popped in a Bill Nye and then you watch Bill Nye like all through elementary school. No. The mitochondria is so much more than just the powerhouse of the cell. Like, because it really is just like the powerhouse of the cell. But what's important to think about is think about it as a powerhouse or like a power plant. A power plant doesn't actually do the work on its own, right? It's just the place where the power is made. And the mitochondria is no different. It's just the place where the energy is made in the cell. And so what is actually doing the work inside of there? Well, what's actually doing the work inside of the organelle is the protein. And so the mitochondria may be the powerhouse of the cell, but it's the proteins that get the work done to make the power. And proteins are a polymer that are made out of something very specific that is called amino acids. Now, if you're going to remember a word here, remember amino acids. Proteins are chains of amino acids. So what they are is really just a bunch of amino acids connected together over and over and over again. Okay? And so what we end up seeing with these proteins is that there are 20 different amino acids and they get connected together in a chain, meaning there are like an infinite variety of proteins that could be made. The order that they get connected in is what determines the structure of the protein. And remember, structure determines function. And so the function of the protein is determined by the order of the amino acids being connected. And that's like a hugely important thing when we're talking about how proteins actually work. Remember, proteins work because of their shape, and their shape comes from which amino acids get connected together. Okay? So now that we understand how a protein is built, let's take a look at how it actually relates to DNA. So to understand how proteins relate to DNA, we need to look at a piece of DNA. And so here I have my molecule of DNA. Remember, it's made out of a phosphate, sugar, nitrogenous base, that makes up a nucleotide, and those connect together to make our strand of DNA. Now, what we should think about, remember the goal of this was to understand what is the function of DNA. Well, the function of DNA really is just to store information. So think about the way that we store information anywhere. I think a great example is, let's think about your computer or your phone or any computerized device stores its information in binary code. It stores it in a sequence of zeros and ones. So 1, 1, 0 means a different thing from 0, 0, 1. Even think about the way that you store information using language. You store information using a sequence of symbols, and that sequence of symbols allows you to represent different objects. So if you go like D-O-G, that means dog, right? But if you change those letters and go C-O-G, it means a different thing. It means cog, right? So changing the sequence changes the information that you store. DNA also stores information, and it stores information using its sequence. The sequence that DNA uses is the sequence from the nucleotides, or the nitrogenous bases. Remember, each of those nitrogenous bases has a letter, and that letter determines, or the order of those letters is the sequence for DNA. Now, this sequence is where the actual function of DNA is held. Now, it stores information, but what information is it actually storing? Well, DNA is storing the information for building proteins. The way I like to think of it is that DNA is a recipe for proteins. Right? When you read a recipe, you can go through, you can find all the information that you need, and you can put that together into something bigger. And that's what DNA is. DNA is a recipe where the cell comes along and reads all the different parts, and it translates that into a protein. The way that it translates this is using the genetic code. The genetic code is the translator for going from the language of DNA into the language of amino acids and proteins. So here's what would happen in your cell. Your DNA is going to change this information into protein. And the way that it does this is just, remember, it's storing information. Now, information in a sequence is often stored in words, right? We put together words, and those words mean something. Well, DNA is no different. DNA has words as well. The only difference is DNA's words are always 3 letters long. So my stretch of DNA has 9 nucleotides, which means there are 3 words in the DNA. These words then get changed into amino acids. So let's jump back to our genetic code. If you remember, my previous DNA had the 3-letter code ATG. Now what this means is the amino acid MET, or methionine. So what your cell does is it comes along and it reads the DNA and says ATG. Well, that means use the amino acid methionine, MET. Then your cell comes along and reads the next three letters. So it goes, okay, TTC. So let's take a look at our information here. TTC, sorry, you don't need to watch me read. TTC stands for phenylalanine, or PHE. So then what it does is it says, okay, next thing I need to do is use the amino acid phenylalanine. And then, because these two words are next to each other, I'm going to connect those two amino acids together. And as soon as you connect two amino acids together, you have built protein. So let's take a look at what our next amino acid would be. So we have GAC. So GAC, if we take a look at the genetic code, stands for asparagine, ASP. At least I think that's what it stands for. I don't really remember all of the three-letter codes. If your mom is like a biochemist, she definitely knows what they are. Okay, and this is what happens inside of your cell. Your cell reads those three-letter codes, and it changes them, and it tells the cell which amino acids to connect together. These three-letter codes also have a name. They are called codons. A codon is just a three-letter word that stands for an amino acid. Now, one of the greatest things that I think humanity has ever done is create, well, not even create, to discover the genetic code, right? If you think about like the Rosetta Stone translates different languages so that we can actually figure out what each language means. And, you know, that's something we talked about when we were at the Museum of Antiquities. I didn't really pay attention that day, and I can't remember off the top of my head like which languages, but you know, you were paying attention, right? Except for Johnson, he was doing math. But, you know, if we jump back to the genetic code, there's some really interesting things aside from my virus protection that we can learn about. So, as you probably noticed, certain amino acids, let's look at like LEU for a second, actually has more than one codon. This is a pretty amazing thing because let's say the information in your DNA gets changed just a tiny little bit. If it gets changed, it could actually change the protein that gets built. And if it changes the protein, it'll change the structure, which will change the function. And if your proteins aren't working right, whew, that's going to be a bad day. Now, by having multiple codons for each amino acid, you end up negating some of those effects once in a while. The other thing I wanted to point out is these three. You notice TAA, TAG, and TGA all say stop. Well, stop means exactly what it says. It is when the cell is reading the DNA and then it gets to TAA, TAG, or TGA. And it says, okay, I'm going to stop building my protein. I am done my work for the day. And it's able to actually just cut off a protein. Remember, DNA is storing information. In the English language, when we reach the end of a sentence, we put a period. And that's exactly what your cell does with its DNA and having those stop codons. The stops are like the period at the end of your DNA sentence. So what is that sentence? Well, a stretch of DNA that creates a protein is called a gene. And that is what we mean when we actually say genes. It's just a piece of DNA that codes for a protein. A single strand of DNA can have hundreds or thousands of genes, each one building its own protein and each protein having its own specific job. All of your cells have the same protein, the same DNA. And so they carry the information to build the same proteins, but in some of your cells, it turns off some of those genes. And that means you can get different cells like skin cells or liver cells or muscle cells or brain cells or all of the different cells that you end up producing. And this is really ultimately how your cell uses DNA to control its functions. The DNA stores the information to build proteins. The proteins then get built and carry out all of the functions inside of your cells. That is really the main point here. DNA uses its structure to store information, to build proteins, and those proteins then get built and have their structure to carry out all of the functions in your cell. So carry that all the way through. DNA controls the functions of your cells by storing the information to build the working molecules inside of every single cell in every living thing across the entire planet. Like, if that doesn't blow your mind, it should. So when people talk about how DNA is a blueprint, it's probably much more correct to think of DNA as a recipe, an instruction guide for building proteins. I have my own unique set of DNA, and my set of DNA tells my cells how to build me. You have your own set of DNA which tells your cells how to build you. A plant has its own DNA that tells it how to build that plant. And everybody's DNA is just slightly different. Every organism's DNA is slightly different from its brothers, its sisters, its parents, its ancestors. And this buildup of change over time leads to different organisms developing different traits. And that's where we're going to go next time, is we're actually going to be talking about traits and how DNA determines why we look the way that we do and why my mustache like can't connect to my beard. What's that all about? Okay, see you next time.